Not long left to the return of the Premier League. You've got to wait just a few hours more until Arsenal are back, the international break's over, and we can finally get on with our lives. This is the Arsenal News Show. Hello and welcome to the Gooner Talk, back again with you guys and girls for another episode of what is the Arsenal News Show. Joining you every single morning at 8 a.m. UK time. Thank you as always for joining me and making this a part of your morning routines. Let's jump to the chat box and say good morning to those joining us. I hope you're doing good. I hope you're doing well. Glenn, Tom, John, Damien, Blackshine, Rob, Paul. We've got Matt G, Stephen, Grantley Poos, Rowan, Barry, Amesy, Olawale. We've got Amira and Arasilki, Frank, Shari, Rancid. We've got James and Louis and PW. We've got Evan and Lars. Thank you to you all. Really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you for doing so. And thank you for all the kind messages that were left on yesterday's show, either in post or during the live chat. Thank you to you all. Had a very chill, enjoyable day, to be fair. I just get outside, go for a bit of a very chilly walk. It's like 1 degree here. In fact, it might even be a little bit colder than that here this morning. It's very cold. Back to classic UK winter weather. No more warm winters as we seemingly experienced last year. But yeah, it was an enjoyable day. Got to see a few people, family, friends. The main stuff is tomorrow. I'm going to the game and then rushing back for some celebrations in the evening. So as I said, there's not going to be a show on Sunday. But there will be a show for you on Monday. So obviously Sunday would usually be kind of the reaction show to the game the night before. On Monday, you're going to get a pre-recorded podcast with a few guests, I'm hoping, all about the game on Saturday. So apologies that there's going to be no show on Sunday. I hope you can understand. Saturday evening is birthday celebrations, and I'm unable to do a show. I thought I was going to be able to do a show on Monday morning, but one of the presents that I've got means that I can't, which will become clear as the live show on Tuesday will be back to the usual settings. But I won't be here. And you'll see where I'm going to be on Tuesday when hopefully you tune in. So this is actually going to be tomorrow morning. We'll have a show tomorrow morning, of course, but tomorrow will be the first or the last live show for a couple of days. But you'll have a podcast about the game on Monday morning going out, and then I'll be back to the usual live stuff on Tuesday. So yeah, lovely stuff. Right, without further ado, let's jump into today's stories. Please make sure you drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you're new around here with those notifications turned on so you never miss a show. So last night, Arsenal left it very late in the UEFA Women's Champions League with Lena Hurtig scoring an 89th minute winner against Juventus to pretty much guarantee Arsenal's progression through until the last the knockout stages of the competition. Of course, they've still got to play 2 more games. They've got to play Vålerenga, who sit bottom of the table on just 1 point, and they've got to play Bayern Munich, who they were battered by under Jonas Eidevall. Maybe it will be different when Bayern Munich return to London for the reverse fixture. In fact, Bayern Munich only managed a 1-1 draw with Vålerenga last night, which means, of course, that Arsenal are only 1 point behind them in the group, meaning if Arsenal win their last 2 games, they will finish top of their Champions League group and above Bayern Munich. So a really good opportunity for them to get to the top of the group in next few weeks' time. Meanwhile, moving into the men's side of things, Bukayo Saka is facing a race against time to be fit for our game against Nottingham Forest. Sammy Mokbel of the Mail reporting that the Arsenal winger still not yet fully recovered, it seems, from that issue he suffered against Chelsea and why he had to pull out of action against Chelsea. Saka, of course, as we know, has had some issues already this season, which meant he missed the Bournemouth game. I had to come back pretty, I wouldn't describe it as fresh against Liverpool, but I had to come back and could only finish around 75 minutes of the game. So, yeah, not great. And certainly Saka will be pushing as hard as he can to make it back for the game. But we will hear more about Saka and Rice and Calafiori and Tomiyasu and Tierney and Ødegaard in Mikel Arteta's press conference, which is set to take place later on today. Mikel Arteta, of course, facing the media as usual ahead of all these games, and we'll find out just whether or not these players are indeed fit. We certainly hope that they're going to be fit, because if they're not, Arsenal are going to have to rotate quite considerably. And of course, we've got more games coming out. That press conference takes place in the early part of this afternoon. But Arsenal play Nottingham Forest, of course, on Saturday at 3 o'clock before going to Lisbon on Tuesday to face Sporting. I'm not going to Lisbon, by the way. I realise that some people might assume that based upon what I was saying a second ago, but no, Lisbon is not. Lisbon's not where I'm going. I realise now that people might assume that, but no, sadly not going to Lisbon on Tuesday, but going, I think, somewhere better. But I'll tell you all about that when I'm there on Tuesday. Right, that brings us to the end of... No, it doesn't. What am I talking about? We've got one more story, the main story, the biggest of stories in today's show. Somehow I wanted to end this before we got to it for some reason. Not with it, clearly 30s. Oh, goodness me, the brain is deteriorating already. Leandro Trossard reportedly in talks over a new deal with, of course, Arsenal. His current deal runs out at the end of next season. It runs out in 2026, meaning that going into that end of season period, he will just have 1 year left on the campaign, which means that we've gone past that 2-year threshold. Of course, for Trossard, as clubs like Arsenal we don't tend to have players falling into those lower categories. And this has caused quite a bit of debate. I had debates on Blue Sky about this yesterday, which I have to say were very enjoyable debates. Back and forths, politely put, some good opinions being put forward. And I had some debates on Twitter, which weren't those things. But when it comes to Trossard, I personally, from my perspective, think this is an absolute no-brainer of a decision to renew Leandro Trossard's contract. Leandro Trossard scored 17 goals for us last season. This season, of course, he's only popped up with 2. But we have to admit and look at the bigger picture that overall, so far this season, everyone has been underwhelming. The whole team has been underwhelming. It's difficult to kind of get a bigger picture on individuals when overall we have been so poor. And yet he still popped up with one of the most important goals of the season so far, which of course was that goal at Aston Villa in the early stages of the campaign. And for me, if you're looking at our left-hand side, if you're looking at what players need to be upgraded on, for me, Trossard, if we are to bring in 2 more forwards, and I think Arsenal personally do, we need to be going out and adding a versatile forward who can play right, who can play left, who can play potentially through the middle. And I think we need to go out and add that top quality centre forward. But the reality is that Bukayo Saka is going to be starting on our right. We want a player who's versatile, who can give us cover there, yes. But Bukayo Saka is going to be starting in that right-hand side slot. Havertz can offer us depth at centre forward, but also playing as a 10. And the player for me that is in the most danger right now, and perhaps has got the most question marks about him of all of our, what we would describe as our starters and starting quality players, is Gabriel Martinelli. Right now, Gabriel Martinelli is at something of a crossroads. Over the last 18 months, Trossard has outperformed Martinelli consistently, whereas Martinelli in his 22-23 season, his best season in an Arsenal shirt, the season where it made us think, all of us thought, this guy's going to carry on and develop in a similar fashion to Saka. And of course, that has not happened for him over the last 18 months or so. Whereas Trossard, of course, has delivered significantly important goals in huge games for us. You think about PSG this season, of course, at home. You think about the games last season against Porto. You think about the game away at Manchester United. You think about the game against Chelsea. You think about all of these goals and more, of course. Not just these goals, but he scored after coming off the 25 minutes off the bench against Everton. In fact, I was having discussions with people yesterday specifically about kind of what he's done. Sevilla away, he started and scored. Wolves away, he started and scored. Chelsea at home, he started and scored. These are goals in games that he has started, but he's also come off the bench and scored against Liverpool, scored against Bayern Munich. This is all last season, less than 6 months ago. And the difference between that and Gabriel Martinelli is the idea of if Arsenal are going to go into the market and add 2 top early to mid-20s forwards, one being a centre forward, the other one being a versatile forward. And that's what I personally want Arsenal to do. And I think we have to. You're not going to bring in that potentially starting forward figure that can play in a wide area to replace Trossard. If we're being very honest with ourselves, that player is going to replace Gabriel Martinelli. And then you've got a player like Trossard, who's 29, and is going to be a great foil to all of those players. Trossard, for me, has always been something of our own Diogo Jota, a player that when you've got Sadio Mane and Firmino and when you've got Salah there as well, that Diogo Jota offers you competitive backup to those players, a competitor more than a backup. And then you look at now with Diaz, Salah, and Nunez, or Diaz, Salah, and Gakpo. Jota still provides that really strong competitive option for Liverpool. And I've looked at Trossard very much as our kind of Jota figure. Martinelli, for me, has got a huge rest of the season ahead of him to justify why he should play there. And Trossard is obviously much more versatile than what Martinelli is. Martinelli doesn't really play as a centre forward. He's never really performed for us on the right-hand side. I don't know if he's even got a goal on the right-hand side for us, where, of course, Trossard, with that Leeds game, where, of course, he did start on that right-hand side for us and scored, and has obviously played plenty of games through the middle for Arsenal. And that time, I think he got 3 assists against Fulham and had 5 games in a row where he contributed a goal contribution every single game, where we went on that winning record with him playing at centre forward. So we know, of course, he's a much more versatile player at a more successful level than what Martinelli is. And I just think that if we're going to be adding 2 quality forwards to our team, then it's going to be Martinelli, I think, that is the one that will be the more likely player to step back. And also, if we are going to make money from a player to be able to replace those players, how much money are you going to make from a sale of Trossard compared to how much are you going to make from a potential sale of 23, 24-year-old Martinelli? And I think all of those factors combined means that it's far more sensible to keep hold of Trossard and then cash in if you are to cash in, which I think, clubs, you look at Man City with Julian Alvarez, you look at Liverpool with the players they've sold in the past as well in key positions that they've not necessarily wanted to, but have had to. Coutinho being a key one that stands out. I don't want Martinelli gone. I'm just looking at the bigger picture of who's more likely to leave and who's more likely of the two to give Arsenal a bigger impact in games. And consistently, we know that to be Trossard of the two. So if you're going to go out and add 2 top forwards, and you've got to sacrifice one of our starting figures, and it's going to be one of Trossard or Martinelli, it's probably Martinelli. Now, I sincerely hope that Martinelli proves me wrong over the next 6 months plus and has a storming season where he gives Arsenal no choice but to want to keep him and for us to be in that position. But for me, it's an absolute no-brainer to keep Trossard at the club for the foreseeable future, and a contract would be certainly the right decision. But we're going to get your thoughts and more in part 2, and I've obviously left a poll in there as well. So leave your votes on that poll and what you think right after this. Okay, this is part 2 of the show, where we jump into the chat box and tackle some of your questions and thoughts. So without further ado, let's check on our poll. I think we should, shall we? So of the well over 200 of you currently voting on our poll in the chat box, it is a 75-25 split right now. 75% of you would indeed give Leo Trossard a small extension to the 27-28 season. That's a 2-year extension on his current deal, which would be just close to a 3-year deal, with an increased wage packet as well. And, for context, Trossard's our 10th highest earner at the moment in the club setup. Is Trossard our 10th best player in the team? Are there players that are earning considerably more than him that are nowhere near that level, in terms of ranking, in terms of the contribution that Trossard makes to our team? Yes, is the answer. So this contract would be bringing him in line more so with where he sits in the pecking order of the team's players. I think if we were having this conversation after he scored that goal against Aston Villa, the mood would be very different. I do genuinely think that the last kind of 2 months of the team performance, not just Trossard, but the team's performances, I think may have skewed kind of people's views on this. So I'm trying to take a step back and look at the wider context, the contribution of Trossard compared to somebody like Martinelli over the last 18 months, the big games he's scored and the big goals he's come off the bench and scored. And that is another thing. Like, if we're going to add those two forwards, the reality is that one of either Trossard or Martinelli is going to be spending, if not both of them, more time on the bench. And of the two of them, who is the player that gives you a lot more coming off the bench? It's Leo Trossard. Like, it's not even a contest at this stage. So that, I think, again, leans itself if you have to choose. And maybe we don't even have to choose. There's no argument that we have to sell one of them. It's just, of the two, who has contributed more in the last 18 months? It's Trossard. Who looks like they're going to contribute more in the next 18 months? It's Leandro Trossard. So I just don't really see the argument to the contrary to that right now. RM says, from a squad building perspective, it makes sense to keep Martinelli and not Trossard. We already have two other false nines in Havertz and Jesus. I mean, Trossard isn't a false nine. Trossard is a left wide forward. That is his best position. He can play in a false nine role, but that isn't his role in the team. That is a needs-must situation, like with most versatile players. He is a left wide forward. That is Trossard's best position as a player. That's where he should play. That's where he's played the most games for us. That's where he's played the most games for his country. That's where he played the most games for Brighton. That is his position. So it's not a case of we've got two other false nines in Havertz and Jesus. And by the way, Jesus needs to get gone. So Jesus, for me, doesn't even factor in this situation. Jesus should be being moved on in the summer. And by the way, when we're talking about pace as well, which I see RM brought up, that is an element of both of those two forwards that I want to see brought in. When we see two players brought in, a centre forward and a wide player that can play on either flank, pace is a prerequisite. It is an absolute must. I don't want Arsenal signing any slow, playmakery forwards. I want Arsenal signing powerful, rapid, technical players for our forward positions. So the pace side of things, if Martinelli was to go, would be offset by what you would ultimately bring in. Greg says, hi, Tom. Currently sat on a sunbed in Egypt, but I can't miss the show. What's your thoughts on Saka and Martinelli switching wings in the game or often try and create more in a game? We haven't seen that all that much, have we? Like, we haven't seen either of kind of Martinelli or Trossard or Saka in games switch kind of positions. And I do think that there is an argument that when we look at when we look at the fluidity of the team, the unpredictability of the team, do Arsenal need to be better, if you like? Do Arsenal need to be better at being more unpredictable? The answer is yes. We absolutely do. I think that's ultimately really, really important. I think you need to have that unpredictability. You need to keep your opponent guessing, and we do need to switch those flanks a little bit more. RM says, Arteta described Trossard as a false nine in a post-match presser. I can read you the exact quote if you like, RM. He was asked, this article is in November of 2023, so there's a lot of football that's been played, of course, since then. Trossard's recent comments on his favourite role to play may alert Arteta that he could play the 28-year-old alongside Saka, Jesus and Martinelli when asked what position he feels most comfortable playing in. Arteta said, that's a tough question. I really don't mind playing all those positions up top, to be fair. If it's left winger, that's what he says first, as a false nine, even as an attacking midfielder, I don't really have a straight answer for that. As a kid, I played as a number 10, like a proper attacking midfielder back in the old days, or as a striker as well. I always tried to be in the box and in good positions to score goals with the quality that we have. I know I have to be there, especially if I play on the left wing. I need to be there when, for example, Bukayo Saka is on the ball on the right side. So, yeah, I follow my instinct there, to be honest, and to get into the right position. So, a classic example, maybe I remember taking a quote out of context there when, of course, in that quote, he mentions all three positions, first mentioning the left side, before then mentioning the false nine position as well. Akubra says, I heard Tierney is back. What's your thoughts on this? Do you think that he'll hit the ground running or he'll be very cautious based on the type of injury he has had and how debilitating it was? I don't know how much we're going to see of Kieran Tierney, to be honest. I don't know if we're going to see much of him. I think it will be reliant on some players being injured. It may be reliant on certain competitions like the League Cup. So I'm not sure, Deck Cooper. I think that Tierney could be in with a shot of getting some minutes, but I'm not sure when, because when we had seen him before, he wasn't really doing what Arteta wanted from a left back, and that's kind of what is the issue. But we have been very reliant on crossing recently, and we do know if there's one thing Tierney can do, is put the ball in the box. Oki says Trossard has reached his ceiling or very close to it. Martinelli still has room to grow despite all the criticism he's getting. Trossard is best off the bench, and Martinelli can do both. I mean, when was the last time Martinelli did score off the bench? Can anyone tell me how many games they stand in their memory that Martinelli's come off the bench and scored? Might be being unfair, but I'm trying to think of what games Martinelli has come off the bench and scored in that stick in my memory. I think Aston Villa away from home. You think when he ran through to score the fourth goal after Jorginho had scored the winning goal. Other than that, anybody? Off the bench, Gabriel Martinelli goals. Scroll in the chat box. City game, like City, yes, City at home. That deflected strike from Havertz laying him off. So we've got City at home, and we've got Aston Villa away, which is kind of the fourth goal. And of course, he was injured for that game. That's why he didn't start the game against Man City. And finish the game. But that's it, isn't it? It's Man City at home and it's Aston Villa. I'm looking through his stats now. Man City at home, Aston Villa away. And the last, including this one, the last 3 seasons, that is Martinelli's contributions from the bench. Going back to the season before, if there is another example. He came off the bench to score the second goal at home to Newcastle after Bukayo Saka had given Arsenal the lead in that game. We won that game 2-0. Going down a little bit more, that's it. Just the one goal off the bench in that season. But to be fair, he starts most games, so we haven't got really a big sample size. But I don't think it would be fair to say that based upon 3 goals in 3 seasons that Martinelli can do both. We know he can definitely do one of them. He can definitely produce, when he starts games, to a degree, and in the last 18 months there's been a question mark about that. I also don't like this assumption that just because Martinelli is 23, 24 and Trossard's 29, that naturally Trossard in these next 2 or 3 seasons is going to drop off the face of the earth. I don't like that assumption, because if you've learned anything about watching football in the last 4 to 5 years, all we have seen is players continue to play into their 30s and into past the age of 35 in many cases, and deliver. And Trossard has been a top Premier League performer, pretty much ever since he arrived here with Brighton, and moving to Arsenal, he's continued that. So I don't like this assumption that in the next 2 to 3 years, Martinelli will offer more than what Trossard will. There's no guarantee of that. And based upon what we've seen in the last 18 months, there's only one player that gives you more assurance that they're going to deliver, especially in big moments. And it's not Martinelli. And I feel like this show is coming across really as a Martinelli bashing session, and I don't want it to come across that way. And I want to say this clear now. I want nothing more than for Martinelli to go on and have a brilliant career with Arsenal, if that is indeed what he is destined to achieve. I'm just being realistic. I'm just being realistic about what we have seen ultimately from both players in the last 18 months. Mr. Happy says, nobody has said Trossard will fall off a cliff, just that he will steadily decline. I mean, I'm disagreeing with that, Mr. Happy. There's no guarantee that he will steadily decline over the next 2 to 3 years. There is no guarantee of that at all. Absolutely none. So I'm not making that up, and I'm picking at the point that you've raised. There is no guarantee that Trossard will steadily decline over the next 2 to 3 years, because there's so many examples of players pushing into the. I mean, you look at how Benzema's transformed. You think Bayern Munich were done with Lewandowski. You see how he's done at Barcelona. I do get a little bit tired, I think, with these assumptions about players. Mr. Abbott says all players steadily. No, they don't. No, they don't steadily decline. All of them. They just don't. The way in which sports psychology, the way in which sports therapy and sports science has developed over the last decade, football players are easily comfortable at delivering well into their 30s. And there is no guarantee that those players will indeed decline, guaranteed. I just don't agree with that. I don't agree that all players do steadily decline. I mean, this isn't a video game, right? We're not playing career mode on FIFA. It's just a reality. Players can maintain a very good level. Some players can even improve going into their 30s. And that's the reality. So to make the assumption that every player goes through a gradual decline as soon as they hit 30, and I'm not taking this personally just because I hit the age yesterday, but just to assume that every player goes through that is the reality. RM says exceptions do not make the rule, but that's why I try and quote correctly though, RM, because if we're going to talk about being correct, it's important that we use the correct quotes about people as well. Because Arteta has said categorically that he feels that Arteta can play in multiple positions. He feels that they can play in that position as a false nine. But to suggest that Arteta saying that he can play there doesn't mean that his best position or where Arteta sees him as his mainstay isn't on the left. Because if you look at the number of times he's played him in both positions, the answer is obvious. If you look at the way he talks about him as a left winger, the answer is obvious. So, I just think you've missed on that one, personally. I just think that the use of the quote on Arteta there was wrong. Loga says, if it's a question of potential, don't you think Martinelli has greater? If it's a question of potential, are we going to see Martinelli hit a 17-goal season based upon what we've seen from Martinelli in the last 18 months? It's very hard to see that. It's very hard to see that. I also think that something that's also coming up quite a lot is if Calafiori comes back, and I say this as well, if Calafiori comes back, if Mikel Moreno hits form, Martinelli will benefit from that. And I personally think that if you are relying on other players to be better or even just present in a team for a player to deliver their best, I think you have to start looking at your standards. And I think you have to start thinking about, do Arsenal need players that are reliant on other players being ready and fit and at their best for them to perform? Or do Arsenal need to be in a position whereby the players we have can perform regardless of who is ultimately in their positions? What do you think? I'm very curious to know what you think. Because I personally want Arsenal to be in a position where we can be reliant on a player to individually perform. And if you think about the two, who is more likely to perform individually? Well, the answer is pretty obvious, isn't it? The answer is pretty darn obvious. Because it's obviously Leandro Trossard. Mr. Abbott says, do you think that Harry Kane is declining into his 30s? Well, in his 29th year, he scored 32 goals. In his 28th year, he scored 27 goals. So he's gone from the age of 28 scoring 27, the age of 29 scoring 32, the age of 30 scoring 44 in 45 games. And this season he's got 17 in 16 already. So last season he managed to score one goal less than the 45 games he played. At the age of 31, 1 year older into his 30s, he scored 17 goals in 16 games. So thank you, Mr. Happy, for providing me a fantastic example of a player who's going and scoring more goals into their 30s. Thank you. RM says, Arteta and Jesus and Havertz, it flows. There is good chemistry between them. And as well as Leo, the three have that false nine profile. Where is the misuse of the quotes? Because you're claiming that this quote is a conclusion that Leandro Trossard is a false nine. That's one of his positions. At what point did I say he's not a false nine? I told you he's a versatile player that can play at false nine. And when we've used him in that position, of course, Arteta has praised him for that. But if you look at the majority of the games that Arteta has used him in, it's as a left wide forward because that is his position. I mean, we can put a poll into the chat if you like. What position does Trossard play? If you were to say to somebody, if you were describing Trossard's key primary position to anybody, his primary position that he plays, from my perspective, you're saying easily, oh, Trossard's a left forward. He's a left forward. That's his best position. That's where he plays the most games. He's a left forward. And when he plays there, he delivers more. He can deliver as a false nine, can play as a false nine, but he's a left wide forward. That's his role. Mr. Harry says, comparing Premier League to Bundesliga, laugh my ass off. You're a terrible journalist. Look, don't get embarrassed just because you suggested an example that then got better in his 30s. I'm just saying, don't get embarrassed by that. Just when you offer up an example, of course, to try and prove your point that ends up proving you wrong. I get that that's a little embarrassing. I get that. But don't get personal, man. It's all love. It's all love. Don't have to get angry about it and get personal. Drago says both thrive on the left. We just need the rest around them to be fit. But I get this. And look, the bigger picture is obviously the whole team has not been good enough. The whole team has not been great. And I think that has ultimately affected his position and everybody's positions and everybody's competitiveness. That's the reality. But I just don't think that we can look at the last 2 months of our area of performances and use that as any kind of judgment of all the players in the team. Because if that was the case, no one's done well, really. I mean, Thomas Partey is the only one really who stood out in these last 2 months. Everybody else has been quite poor indeed. Mr. Abbey says Kane hasn't got better. He's in his 30s. He's lost his England place. Has Kane lost his England place? Kane's lost his England place? He just started and captained in the last game and scored in a 5-0 win. In the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games, he started 4 of them in the Nations League. If we go back to the last tournament, which was this summer, he started in the final. He started in the semis. He started in the quarters. He started in the round of 16. He started in Group C in third game. He started in the second game. He started in the first game. Has Kane lost his England place? This isn't faring too well for you, Mr. Happy. I'm gonna be merciful here, and I'm gonna just say I think this one's probably run its course, Mr. Happy. So yeah, I'll put you out your misery at this point. Amira says, in my opinion, if a player is aware enough, they'll know how to adapt their game as they get older. Players who know who they aren't fast will make it up elsewhere, like Jorginho. That's how they prolong their careers. And we aren't. Have you ever thought when watching Leandro Trossard? Because I personally haven't. I've never thought this guy. He's reliant on his pace. When you talk about a player what's their best characteristic? Martinelli's best characteristic is his pace. I don't know if you saw this the other day. Arsenal released a video about as the players entered the training ground, what traits would they take from one of their teammates? And I think the most common answer was Martinelli's pace. That was the most common answer that his teammates gave. And I think from that perspective, like that is his biggest quality, Martinelli. That's what players look at and think. If there's one quality of Martinelli that I want, it's his speed. But with Trossard, like Trossard's ability and Trossard's contributions to the Arsenal team has never been reliant upon that factor. And that said, I mean, if you look at the goal he scored against Liverpool last season, where he runs away from, is it Trent Alexander-Arnold on the right-hand side or Conor Bradley? I can't remember who it was who was on the right-hand side when he scored that goal. But he runs away from them and he gets into the box and he finishes past Alisson with absolute ease because he is a brilliant finisher, is Trossard. In the last, I mean, he missed a big chance against Chelsea. You can't score them all. But if there is a player in the team that you want taking the big chance, it's Trossard over Martinelli, isn't it? Martinelli's defensive work, I'd argue, is better than Trossard. If you're going into a really big game more competitively, you're probably looking at Trossard being on the bench at the current squad that we have to come off and score a big goal at the end. But if you're looking at a team that's like Man City, for instance, that are going to give you probably a tougher time, you're probably looking at Martinelli to start at the moment. But Arsenal need to move into a direction where we are going to dominate all games that we play. And that's why I'm talking about those two players. Those two players that we that we can play and can sign, those two players that we can add to the team. That I think just supersedes it. Like, we're not going to be looking at adding a player that defensively gives you more. That for me is the biggest thing. We're going to look at bringing in players that are going to level us up, that are going to upgrade upon us. So yeah, Kojo says, Tom, you can come across so condescending sometimes. I know I can. I get it. I've done this for 8 years, and when you get people leaving comments like, Tom, you're a terrible journalist. If the worst that I can be accused of, Kojo, is being sarcastic and condescending sometimes after 8 years of abusive comments and terrible takes and just awful things being said to me, that I'll take that, Kojo. I will take that 100,000,000%. If I haven't devolved into a world of abusing people and calling people names, and the worst that you can accuse me of is being sarcastic or condescending, despite far worse things being said to me, Kojo, I will take that. So that is absolutely fine by me, and you're more than entitled to have your view and call me that if you like. Barry says Martinelli is one of the hardest working players in the team. All he needs is a few goals and his confidence, and he'll be rocking again. And I sincerely hope, Barry, that that's the case. Don't get me wrong. I sincerely hope that they will, that Martinelli will be a very, very good player that delivers for us into the long term. I really, really am. Bulgarian Gooner says, what's more likely to happen? 1, Trossard's form falling off of a cliff, or 2, Martinelli failing to improve his technical ability? I'm more worried about the second one. Okay, so the biggest criticism that I've had of Martinelli is definitely on the technical side, and it's on that final ball, that final decision, that final touch. For me, he always goes one touch too far. He doesn't take the shot early enough. When the shot comes, more times than not, it's not a clean enough effort. And yes, he's a very confidence-driven player. Very confidence-driven player. Trossard, over the last, since he signed, has kept his level, a very good level, and pretty consistent across all of that. He's delivered in big games. He comes off the bench and performs. When he starts games, he can offer you plenty. And he's not really shown signs, besides these last 2 months, like every single player in the squad has during the form of the last 2 months, of dipping. And he's been playing in his, what I would describe as his weakest position in the number 10 role. I think that's probably been his weakest role, where he can have the least amount of impact on things. So I think that when it comes to those positions, I am in agreement with Drago that I am more concerned that you keep Martinelli, move on Trossard, bring in a player like an Ademola Lookman or a Nico Williams, a player like that is, a versatile, wide player that last season and definitely into this season in regards to Lookman, less so Williams. But say you bring in one of those two, just as an example, I think that for that perspective, I struggle to see why you would rather keep Martinelli of the two, because Trossard's going to offer you more in reserve. Trossard's going to offer you more in bigger games. Trossard's going to offer you more versatility. With his Martinelli, we're constantly waiting. Is he going to take that next step? Is Martinelli going to take that key turn of difference that's going to turn him from a player that has got all this potential and he's got a higher ceiling, as we talk about, and actually get there? Whereas Trossard, for me, is performing more consistently and to a high level and contributing more consistently than Martinelli is now. And I don't see that dipping. So I'd rather buy the player to replace Martinelli that I think is better and keep another better player in Trossard, and then get a lot more money for Martinelli, than the other way around. Because the alternative is you replace Trossard. Imagine this situation, right? How much for you, just out of a ballpark, give me your thoughts in the chat box. How much is Martinelli worth in the market? And really think, don't just type in a random number right now. Think for a second and think, who is going to buy him? How much are they really willing to pay for Martinelli? And also, how much do you think it would take in some ways for Arsenal to be open to a sale? How much do you think Martinelli would fetch us in the market in his terms of his contract? His contract runs out in 2027. So at the end of this, and he's got an option of a further year. So 28, we can call. So at the end of this season, I have 3 years left on his deal. How much is a club going to pay for Martinelli? A player who this season has 3 goals and 3 assists in 17 games. Oh, is it that many games? And last season got 5 goals, 5 assists, and 8 goals in 44 games. How much really is a team going to pay for Martinelli? RM says Martinelli is in the Pedro Neto price range. I would probably agree with you. I think that 45 to 50, 55, that range is probably where I'm at with Martinelli at the moment. A £50 million player, about that. That's what I would probably rank Martinelli as. I don't know who's going to pay that. That's the next question I guess I had for you, is who is going to pay Who is going to pay that 40 to 50 million pounds? What team is going to come in and pay that amount of money? Maybe, I mean, Barca aren't going to do it because they want Nico Williams to play on that left-hand side. Bayern Munich, would Bayern Munich pay that? Atletico Madrid, who's on Atletico Madrid's left-hand side at the moment? Let's have a look at who's on Atletico Madrid's left-hand side right now. I don't really know who's playing on the left-hand side. It shows you how long it's been since I've played that. Last, Riquelme. Who is Riquelme? 24-year-old Riquelme, Spaniard. Yeah, so I guess maybe Atletico. It's not a bad shout, that. Atletico Madrid, says EV, might be, had to be work rate-wise, really kind of falls into that Diego Simeone style of player, doesn't he? So maybe Atletico is a good shout. PSG, some people are saying maybe as well. I think 50 million is probably a fair range. So if that's the reality right now, if we say we get to the summer window and we've got to make a decision, you either renew Trossard or you sell Martinelli 50 million and reinvest that in another wide forward player who I think, you have to look at reinvesting that plus more in a better player, be that a Lookman, be that if you think that's Nico Williams, for example. And by the way, Arsenal were interested in Nico Williams in the summer. It wasn't like Arsenal weren't on the lookout to add potentially a wide player that could even overtake Martinelli in the squad. So that's already, you have to think that's already in the mind of the club. That's already something that they are considering. Also consider, like, when both players are on the field, who is Arteta keeping on the field at the moment? Because it's not Martinelli. Martinelli's being taken off. Trossard is being left on in these games as well. So I think there is a clear indication from an Arteta side of things as well where this is seen right now. And then you have to think about if Trossard's going to be sold at 29 or even in a year's time, which would be the end of his contract, so we've gone on 3. How much are you going to get for Trossard? You're probably looking at like a Saudi club putting up a big wage and a very decent figure. But even then, and not because he's not good, this is worth pointing out, like the value of a player at that age bracket is obviously significantly different to the value of a player at 23, 24. It's very different. And it doesn't tell you the full story about a player's quality or what they're going to give you over the next 2 to 3 years. You're investing 50 to 60 million in Martinelli at 23, 24 over what you can do over the next 6 to 8 years. That's what you're investing in. With Trossard, you're investing in what he's going to do right now for this season, next season, maybe the season after. And that's ultimately what the contract would be, is the season coming up, next season, and probably the season after that. That's what you're investing in terms of a contract extension. I'm not talking about Trossard at 32. I'm talking about Trossard at 29. There's a very big difference, I think, between those two things. If you want to talk about players after 32, you could definitely argue that there's going to be that gradual decline after 32. After 29, between the ages of 29 and 32, we've seen consistent times that players aren't declining. They're not gradually declining. And a lot of them are maintaining performance, or in the case of Harry Kane, are even scoring more goals, at that age as well. So I think from that perspective, you have to look at the bigger picture and say, if Arsenal are going to go into the market and add a Lookman or add a Williams, they're going to replace Martinelli. You're probably going to move Martinelli on, and you're going to be better using Trossard as a better foil to those players that you then bring in, be that the centre forward that we need to bring in and a wide forward that needs to operate at a higher level than Martinelli has done, that's already got a higher technical level like Trossard has already got in those positions. So that's why I am where I'm at with Trossard and Martinelli. That's why I think if we're going into the market and we're adding 2 top forwards, one being a centre forward, one being a wide player, it makes the most sense for that wide player to replace Martinelli in the squad, because I think Trossard is more guaranteed to offer you more goals and more of an impact, especially off the bench. And I think that also Martinelli's price would be able to give you the ability to reinvest that, not just in those forward players, but also in other areas of the team as well. I love Martinelli. I think that he is a fantastic footballer and has got potential. But I can't, at this stage of Arsenal's project, where we need players to deliver, I can't bank on that potential anymore. I just can't. I have to raise my standards. I have to demand more. I have to demand the players that we've got are going to deliver. Because all the while it's fair enough saying, let's keep Martinelli, at the same time, we're also in a position where we're going, we need better players. We need to close the gap to City and now close the gap to Liverpool. I mean, Liverpool at the moment probably have the best left winger in the league at Luis Diaz. They've got one of the best backup left wingers in the league in Cody Gakpo, and they're delivering and they're scoring goals in big games and big. Gakpo's goal the other week was excellent, and he's still a young player himself as well. And Diaz isn't exactly old. I think he's like 28, is he? Luis Diaz. How old is he? Please be older than that. Please let him be near retirement. He's 27. This is what I mean. Like, that's kind of what we're up against right now. And City have brought in Savinho and Doku in the last 2 years. And while I'm not the biggest fan of Doku, I think he's a limited player. I do think that they're looking at investing in younger players as well. I'd rather have Martinelli than Doku right now. I've just never really been convinced by Doku personally. I think he's got the similar problem actually to Martinelli, where his end product is lacking. He himself has got less goals and less assists than Martinelli this season. 2 goals, 2 assists this season compared to Martinelli's 3 goals and 3 assists. Last season for City, he ended up with, if my internet will decide to work quite quicker than it currently is, he ended up with 7 goals and 11 assists. But of those 11 assists, 4 of those came in one game, and he got 5 goal contributions, a 6-1 win over Bournemouth. So stat pads across. So you take that down, you're looking at just sub 10 on both sides, which was a better season than maybe I gave him credit for. Whereas if you look at Martinelli last season Martinelli got, so this season, 3 goals, 3 assists, which by the way is more than Smith Rowe, despite all the talk about Smith Rowe. 8 goals and 5 assists. So he got 1 more goal than Doku, but he got 6 less assists, but 4 of those assists for Doku did come in one game. So they're kind of similar. And I'm not really rating Doku right now. And if Doku's producing more, for than Martinelli is, then in a very, very good season for Arsenal, it's worth pointing out as well. I scored more goals than ever before. Martinelli wasn't fit and fire. It wasn't producing. He wasn't one of our big producers in that season, whereas Trossard was our 3rd highest goal scorer with 17 goals. A lot of them against big sides from the bench and from the start of games as well. So yeah, I feel like I've set out my stall here. I feel like I've been very clear on where I sit, and that's really, really important. Oki says, we also have a history of hanging on to players too long, putting them on big wages, realising they are no longer required, and then struggling to sell them. Much easier for that to happen with Trossard. I'd argue the complete opposite to that, Oki. I'd argue the complete opposite to that, because as we've talked about, Martinelli's value in the market is going to be more than double that of Trossard's right now. And that's not based upon their contributions as players. That's just based upon their age more than anything else. So surely what you want to do is you bring Trossard more in line with the players that are his age bracket, which isn't going to be loads. He's only on 90 grand a week at the moment. So a considerable wage packet isn't going to see him. I'm not saying put him on 200 grand a week. I think that'd be nuts. I'm looking at more than 150, kind of that ballpark. That's what I'm looking at as a considerable wage increase for Trossard. I think if he goes up to 200,000, and I will be critical if Arsenal do that. I don't think that's what we should do. I think that would be silly. But Martinelli, you're looking at potentially keeping on a longer contract if you want to renew him again, because he's got 3 years left. So you play 1 more season, then you're looking at 2 years left. Then you're talking about a renewal, because that's what you do when you get down to 2 years. So you're putting him on another contract. He's already earning well over what Trossard earns. I mean, if we just do a quick Martinelli spot rack to give you a rough ballpark of what Martinelli earns right now. Trossard, as I say, is on 90 grand a week. Martinelli is currently on, why don't you just give me the breakdown of it per week? That'd be really helpful. I've got to get my calculator out now. In 2020, annual 9360 divided by 52. 180 grand a week. That's dollars. So let's say 160. 150,000 pounds. So we literally would be bringing Trossard in line with Martinelli's wage, is what we would be doing. So I think that's the reality, and I think when you're looking at, you're saying putting them on big wages, realizing they're no longer required and struggling to sell them. What if Martinelli doesn't achieve this potential that he's not been achieving? We've kept hold of a player that had a market value that we've not decided to be ruthless with, bringing an upgrade for him. Because I don't know about you, Oki, but if you could sign a better player than Martinelli, would you? Because I would. I want Arsenal to go and win the league. I want Arsenal to get better and better and better. Surely we want to go out and get a better player. Surely we want to go out and get a better player. And if that's the case, then Martinelli's going to be on the bench more. His value is going to drop more. And we aren't going to sell him very well when he's not getting the minutes. And so the reality is you keep a player like Trossard instead, who's got a far better record of scoring from the bench, who isn't going to cost you, the same as what it is going to cost to keep Martinelli as a backup player. And I just think Barry says other players need to go before those two. And that's absolutely right. That's not even up for debate. Like, we all know that. We all know that. But if we're just talking about Martinelli and Trossard, which is what we've done over the last half an hour at least, that's kind of the broader context is that Trossard is probably the smarter keep of the two over the next 2 to 3 seasons when you're looking at investing in bringing in 2 forwards. Rand says you have the opportunity to go and get a player like Kvaratskhelia next summer, but you have to sell Martinelli. Would you do it? Yes. Yes, of course. Of course you would. Why wouldn't you do that? I'm struggling to know who wouldn't do that right now. Is there anyone in the chat, and feel free to lay out your arguments, I don't want a one-word answer to this, who here is not swapping Martinelli for Kvaratskhelia? Who isn't making that choice? Kvaratskhelia currently 23 years of age. He's got 5 goals and 2 assists so far this season for Napoli. Last season, he ended the season on, if my internet speeds up a little, come on, transfer marks, work out. 11 goals and 9 assists. Season before that, that was in 45 games. Season before that, and obviously Martinelli ended the season, 8-5, I think. So 20 goal contributions against 13. And a very struggling Napoli side last season. Season before that, 14 goals, 17 assists. Wow, that's fucking crazy. Oh, I swore. Goodness me. Oh, no. I don't know if it came across. 10 goals and 7 assists the season before that. So, I think that's it's Kvaratskhelia, isn't it? It's an obvious one. And this is what I mean. Like, I'm looking at that level. I'm looking at that level of goal production from your left winger. And this is why I talk about Adam Lookman. And I don't know why people overlook Lookman. No pun intended. He's got 8 goals and 5 assists already this season as Lookman. He's 27 years of age. Last season, he got 17 goals and 10 assists. Season before that, still playing for Atalanta, 15 goals and 8 assists. So you see that rise is constantly improving every season upon season upon season. And Williams, he's not having the best of seasons this year, Williams, and that's a question mark. I think if you're going to look at signing Nico Williams, you have to then you're going to look at 22 years of age now, Williams, got 2 goals and 2 assists in 15 games. That's an eyebrow raiser. That's a concern. And that's why with Gyökeres, for instance, as a centre forward, I wanted to see if he could take it forwards. I wanted to see if he could take that to that next level. Let's scroll up in the chat a bit more. Temi says, Tom, I disagree with keeping a 30-year-old Trossard over a 23-year-old Martinelli. I mean, Temi, that's fine. If you can justify it, then that's fine. If you can justify that, then fine. I haven't got a qualm with that. I haven't got an issue with that. If you personally disagree with keeping a 30-year-old Trossard over a 23-year-old Martinelli, when after everything that we've discussed and all this idea about market values and bringing a player in that's ultimately going to be better than both of them for our left-hand side, which is what I want to personally see, I just think that it's better to not lose money on Martinelli and keep the player that's delivering more and doesn't look like slowing down over the player that we constantly keep saying has a higher ceiling, that's got more to give, but isn't showing it. Then that's fine. If after all of that evidence and all of that discussion, you still believe that, then I can't change your mind. I'm not going to try and change your mind anymore. We just have a different point of view. But thank you for putting it across, Temi, in a respectful way, and I appreciate that. Paul says, isn't any what-if question just guesswork? At this moment, Trossard has been a more consistent scorer, but he's completely lost form. As I say, Paul, as everybody else has. And he's been playing, he's not been like Saka and Havertz and Rice and Partey, not Partey, that's not fair, Saliba and Gabriel and Timber to a lesser extent. Trossard's been playing in his weakest role, arguably not his best, not arguably a position you ever really want to see him playing in, which is the 10. So I think there's much more of a reason why Trossard, out of everybody else that we know has dropped form. And yet he's still, when he's come off the bench and played against Villa, he scored a big goal. When he started against PSG, he scored a massive goal for us. So, I'm struggling I'm struggling with that one. Mason says, is there any trustworthy Northern Ireland Arsenal groups you know of? No, not that I know of, but someone in the chat box or the comment section after the show might indeed be able to do that. Mr. Abbey said Trossard's weakest role is starting games. That, of course, being despite the fact that he started against PSG this season and scored, started against Sevilla and scored, started against Porto and scored, started away at Wolves and scored, started against Chelsea at home and scored, started away at Man United and scored. Despite all of that, ignoring all that evidence, yes, you're absolutely right. RM says, Tom, you need to stop looking at positions and start looking at traits when squad building. That's how Arteta will view it. And I am, RM, looking at the traits. I'm looking at the performances. I'm looking at the output. And I'm looking at the big picture. I'm looking at ultimately what we're seeing from both of those players. And I'm looking also ahead at what I want to see brought in, which is two top forward players, one being a centre forward, the other being a wide player that's ultimately probably going to be a left-sided player that can also operate on the right if you need them to. And when in doing that, I'm looking at Trossard being the better option to have in reserve to Martinelli, who I think, if you're ultimately going to have that player in reserve, is going to shed value every single year. Every single year, he's going to shed value. And I just think it makes more sense to keep the better player that delivers more in bigger moments than the player that doesn't do that as often and that isn't going to play as much when you add the player that's going to take over that position. That's where I'm at, RM, with it. Paul says, since City and Bournemouth, Trossard has looked to shadow himself and he's currently injured. He did get injured against, who was it? Was it Israel, I think, for Belgium? We don't know the extent of that issue, but we don't know how serious that is. But I don't think that's a factor in this, unless it's like a big knee injury or something that keeps him out for months and months and months. That would obviously change the context. But we don't know what the injury is at the moment. And he carried on and then came off and walked off the pitch. It wasn't like a big stretcher scenario. So, yeah, who knows? We'll wait and see. Descent says he is a decent player, but if giving him a bumper contract will prevent us from buying a top winger, that is a problem. I don't think that would happen. Arsenal want to add another forward, and have done and did do in the summer. I think obviously keeping both of them maybe does that. I think keeping both of them does that. And that's why I lead towards, of the two, if you're going to get rid of one, I think you have to sell Martinelli. I think that's you have to do. Temi says, Martinelli finishes well. His chances are more palpable because they are few and far between, and in games where we didn't create much. Live says, then assign a striker and a winger to replace Martinelli. This is what I'm talking about. Like, this whole context of this conversation, it needs to come with the premise that you are bringing in those two players. If you're not, then you keep both of them. Obviously, this isn't a whole sell Martinelli for the love of all that's good in the world. That's not what this is about. This is about if Arsenal are bringing in two top forwards, and you've got to move on one of your other players that you would consider one of the starters. I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm not talking about Sterling. I'm not talking about Nelson. I'm not talking about Vieira. I'm talking about the four that we look at, which are Saka, Trossard, Martinelli, and Havertz. Like, when you're looking at bringing in two forwards, especially for the left-hand side, you're mainly looking at that left-hand side. And you're mainly, therefore, looking at Martinelli of the two. Let's go. From it says, how can you improve your verbal fluency? Talk a lot. Talk as much as you can. I'm not perfect. And I've been talking on this show for goodness knows how long. Just keep talking. Just keep talking. Keep practicing. Especially like publicly if you can. In front of a crowd, in front of an audience. And yeah, it's easier to do it in front of a camera than it is, say, in front of an audience. When we do our live shows, I think I'm probably come across as a lot more nervous on stage than I do here. It's a lot easier to talk to this piece of equipment than it is to talk in front of 100 people or whatever. Paul says, I'm finding this conversation a bit odd as there seems to be a failure to acknowledge Trossard has lost form. Immediately before the break, fans wanted him dropped as he was offering little. Paul, I think that what you're probably missing is that we've talked about the drop of form, and we've talked, and maybe you joined us late, but we talked about how the whole team has been poor. Everybody. Martinelli's been poor. Trossard's been poor. Havertz has been poor. Saka's been poor. Rice has been pretty poor. Saliba's not been great. You know, everybody has been poor. And of all of those poor players, Trossard is the one who is doing is the most out of position. Of all of the players we're talking about, Trossard is the one who's playing the most out of position at the moment. And so I think there's much more of a tangible explanation for Trossard's dip in form than there is everybody else. So I think that's, Paul, why we are where we are with that conversation. Descent says, as you said, we need a striker and a top winger. Hopefully the summer and the January, we will cover them. Otherwise, we will lose track with the other top teams, especially with Guardiola rebuilding City as well. Rich says, Martinelli has been much better than Trossard. Martinelli has fished a few chances, but Trossard's been a complete liability. Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know if we maybe watching different games, Rich, but I wouldn't say that Trossard has been a liability. I would say that the whole team has not been good enough in this period. I'd say that Martinelli has also missed big chances that he should have scored. You think about, obviously, the chance that he scored against Chelsea, but you think about the big chance he had before that as well. I think that's very harsh. Of the two, Trossard's been better this season. Slightly better this season. Last season, it was no contest. Like, Trossard scored 17 goals. But of this season, I still think that Trossard slightly edges it. Slightly edges it in terms of, like, and I know that Martinelli's defensive performance, especially at Man City, was very good, but that's not what we're really going for in terms of, you know, players across the majority of the season. So I struggle with that a bit. I struggle with the argument it's been a liability. Rich says, if we sold Martinelli and extended Trossard, I'd despair. I'd despair if we didn't bring in a brilliant left-sided player. Absolutely. I'd despair if we didn't bring in a top forward player. But if we sold Martinelli and extended Trossard and brought in a much better player than Martinelli, I don't really have an issue, and I don't know why anybody really would, to be honest. Rich says, red card. Rich, I'm pretty sure you were one of the ones in the chat box, were you not, when he got that red card, moaning about how ridiculous that red card was? I'm just saying. I'm just putting that out there. So yeah. Anyway, I think we're getting to the end of this discussion. Let us know, of course, what you think in the chat box. We've been going for over an hour now. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening, as always. Thank you for those that have been respectful, and you know, you'll still be here next week, I'm sure. Thank you for all of you for listening. Really appreciate your time. Have a fantastic rest of your day. We've only got less than 24 hours now. No, just over 24 hours until Arsenal are back and in the fold. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe, stay well, stay happy and respectful. And as always, up the Arsenal.